The Winnipeg Jets youth are currently undefeated. After a weekend of Prospect Showdown action in Montreal, Winnipeg bested both the Habs and the Sens. How'd it go and who stood out? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we have finally had Jets hockey back. This past weekend, we had the Prospect Showdown in Montreal, Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg all engaged. I didn't follow the other games, but I was definitely watching the Jets games. We had some of the later outings, 6 p.m. Central, so the Jets had both Montreal and Ottawa on back-to-back nights with fairly similar lineups, pretty similar rosters, and, the Jets actually won both games, if you can believe it. A pretty fun weekend for all involved, and if you caught the first game against Montreal, you'd know that there were 21,000 fans in attendance for that first game, which is just bonkers, right? A prospect scrimmage, basically, drawing 21,000 fans. Well, there had to be a reason for it. We'll talk a little bit about that, game two, and also talk about a little bit of the overall showdown thoughts. Throughout this week, I also want to talk about individual prospects who really stood out, which players are maybe on the ups in Winnipeg's system, who may be trending down. And then on Wednesday, we'll have an episode sort of detailing which of the guys that were sort of on the verge of pro duty or heading into this pro camp, which of these guys might really start to rise to the top of the season, either for the Moose or for the Jets, and what we can kind of expect heading into preseason. But let's chat about the first game of this Prospect Showdown for the Jets. It was against Montreal, home team. And if you look at Montreal's roster, I got some flack for saying this, but you could kind of tell that the Habs have had a couple of years of really good draft picks. I said it was several years. Somebody was like, are you kidding? It's 22 to 25. And I'm like, maybe I'm just a little bit jaded, but 3 years is a really long time in the NHL. And when you have like 3 consecutive top 5 picks, I kind of feel like you do have a pretty loaded talent pool, right? You are talking about some of the most talented picks that you could possibly get. And everyone in Montreal had to be there to see Demidov. He was amazing. Let's just get that out of the way. When it comes to, prospects that were really putting on a show and who were clearly a level above, a lot of his peers, Demidov was ridiculous. And it's why he's honestly not really a prospect, but an NHL caliber player. Had there not been one particular Jets prospect who was just that much better, Demidov might have had himself a game to remember. But instead, guess who stood up? Dominic DiVincentis. That dude was unbelievable. And really, you just have to love how gutsy Winnipeg's performance was across the board. The Jets don't really have many draft picks above like the second round. There were a couple of guys who are maybe top half of the first round draft picks, but we're talking maybe 13th, 14th overall. Not really much higher than that. So when you think about this going against Reinbacher, Demidov, obviously Slavkovsky's not there, but, quite a few other talented prospects from Montreal's pool were in attendance. This was a very tough test. You had mostly camp invites on the blue line. You had a young Jets group that was probably more in the depth NHLer department than high-end talent. And to make matters worse, not too far into the game for the Jets, one of Montreal's prospects took a bit of a run at Kieran Walton. Clean hit, but Walton got clocked pretty roughly and ended up exiting the game and not returning for the weekend. So the Jets were not only playing shorthanded, they had to survive against a very dangerous Montreal offense that was fast. And when you saw their power play, their passing was crisp. And yet the Jets stood tall and in critical moments delivered some really fun, explosive plays. I don't think anyone quite encapsulates this more than Chase Yoder with his individual effort to cut through a couple of Montreal defenders, drive right towards the slot, and score a highlight reel goal. We also saw goal contributions from guys like Danny Zhilkin, who put on one of his best performances of the tournament with a 2-goal performance. And then we also saw Kobe Barlow get on the score sheet. And a couple of these guys, again, on tomorrow's show and throughout the week, I'm going to focus on a little bit more individually because some of these performances have really given me some excitement for this upcoming pro season, both at the NHL and at the AHL level. And I think the Moose this year, I said it earlier, I think they're going to be a wagon. And a lot of the performances that we saw in this first game, I think, reflect that. Now, listen, right? I did say DiVincentis was kind of the best player in the whole game. And I think that's probably worth standing by. The Jets, they definitely got outplayed. I mean, you're talking about a very different talent gap between Montreal's system and what the Jets have. But what Winnipeg brought was a team that's, quite frankly, really good value for where the Jets are picking. You've got guys like Key, Barlow, Salomonson, some really fun talents here. Of course, Shibrakov returning. And so the Jets were, they're not fielding maybe the most elite prospect group, but this is a very workman group, one that I think put on a very gutsy performance and had a couple of really beautiful plays, especially some bang-bang opportunities that started to really tilt the ice and ended up putting Montreal in a pinch. And then after giving up a breakaway to Demidov right at the end of the game that tied it, Winnipeg found just that extra little bit of a layer of skill, and Zilkin ended up profiting with a game-winning goal in the dying seconds to make it 4-3 Jets. So really fun. I think for a prospect game, you just could not believe that there would be a sold-out Bell Center, and yet here we are, right? 21,000 fans. This, for a lot of these kids who aren't likely to make big pro careers in the long term, this might be the biggest crowd that they ever play in front of. And so I think it's really cool that the Habs fans all came together and put on this much of a show. And, the game on the ice really did not feel like a prospect showdown. You think about Penticton, you think about some of the training camp stuff, some of the fan festival performances. Nothing has ever really looked quite like this, at least from my memory. And you look at the other prospect tournaments across North America, none of them were putting on the show that Montreal did. So what a cool first game. It was definitely the most exciting game, I would say, of the whole tournament. It felt like a really big high-stakes clash, and it was probably because you had some superstar talents on the ice. But in the end, the Jets prevailed. They do what they've done since the Maurice era, and they really leaned on their goalie to give them a real shot to win. And the boys, or rather the young lads, I should say, ended up really taking it. They had some good highlight reel moments, some really hard work on the forecheck, couple of key defensive plays, huge stops from DiVincentis, and it ended up being enough to get them to a 4-3 victory, which would then kind of catapult them into what should have been probably a loss against the Senators, right? Tired legs, you're on the second half of a back-to-back, you have basically most of the same lineup as the day before. Surely, Ottawa, which had its own good performance in its first game, would take advantage of the Jets. But instead, Winnipeg flipped the script again, and we'll talk about who stood out coming right up in just a moment. But before we do, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Indeed. You just found out that you needed to hire somebody yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates quickly? Well, it's easy when you use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. I used Indeed when I was looking for work a few years ago. I can attest to how convenient it is, how easy and how comprehensive the resume builder is. It actually creates a profile for you that matches to all of a job listing's specifications, your own desires for salary, your work experience, etc. So if you're a business looking to hire quality employees, you're going to get immediate matches fast with this great system through Indeed. And now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about, the Prospect Showdown, kind of recapping the games. If you missed the first bit, I just mentioned that throughout this week, up until probably Wednesday or so, I'll focus on some prospects, talk about individual performances, and how that might impact the upcoming pro season at both the AHL and NHL levels. But this episode, we're talking a lot about the game specifically. In game two, after a really thrilling first game against the Canadians, you thought, the Sens had a pretty good performance of their own with Yakemchuk and a few others putting on really good shows. But how would the Jets do, right? Tired legs. You're coming into the second half of a back-to-back. You lost one of your skaters in Walton. So, you have to call it a little bit more on the reserves and depth. And the Jets, I thought, again, they did get outplayed. And I think one of the themes of this tournament that was definitely clear was that the Jets invited a lot of the, I'd say, camp invitee sort for their back end, which is fine. I think Zalotti actually did pretty well, and you saw some solid shifts from a couple of other guys. But other than that, I think it was, a lot of Salamonson and Angle having to do quite a bit of the work. And, Angle's very young. I think his puck moving ability is certainly there, but you could kind of see him get outpositioned and outbodied. And so it was a little bit harder for the Jets as a whole with a back end that's maybe a little less experienced to get clean zone exits, to make transitions up the ice. And I think that was probably a theme that really showed up in the Sens game. Montreal, you could sort of understand because the skill level, especially of like the top six, was at a bit of a different level than what the Jets were bringing. But in the game against the Sens, I'd say the skill levels were a little bit more even, and it was just tough for the Jets, right? Winnipeg was slower. You could kind of tell that they had played the previous night, and there were moments where the Sens definitely got the Jets kind of chasing the puck, certainly on their heels. But one thing that Winnipeg really just refused to do was to back down. And I think that that's kind of been a hallmark of this franchise the last few years. Even when they're having to fight for every puck, block every shot, and sort of scramble in the crease, they just tried to hold, strong and make sure that they gave at least Worthington or whoever else was in net a chance to make the save, to try and clear the slot and, get the puck out of the zone. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't have to be. And I think the Jets just really stuck with it. They just committed to keep, doing what they were doing, and it ended up paying off. You had a Zalotti goal off of a really nice counter after the Jets had been hemmed in. You had Zilkin, again, contributing on the score sheet. You had a great sequence on the power play where we actually had a Jacob Julian goal, which I wasn't expecting. Julian ended up getting a tip deflection from a Chibrikov goal, assisted by Jaeger. So, some really cool moments here, and I think for Jets fans, it's the kind of stuff that you want to see, a nice team victory. Winnipeg did have to go to overtime. Obviously, for the offense, it was a little bit of a tough going. The Jets didn't generate a ton of shots against Beckman in the Sens net. Rather, it was Worthington who really had to stand on his head. And wow, yet again, we had a Jets goalie prospect doing really well, despite being absolutely peppered. That's obviously going to be a little bit of a focus on tomorrow's episode because I think the Jets goalie pipeline in general is fascinating and something worth talking about by its own merits. But just for this game, again, Worthington put on a great show. Between this and DiVincentis' performances, I suppose you could say the Jets aren't too worried about their goalie depth going forward, even as Hellebuyck continues to eat the lion's share of starts for the big club. So lots of fun stuff. If we're talking about some other interesting notes, what I will say is, despite the lack of elite skill in some of these tournaments for the Jets, Winnipeg still brought a very competitive roster. And again, despite having not a lot of puck moving ability on the back end, I still think the Jets tried to make the best of it, and it was still fun. This crowd was obviously a lot smaller because Montreal's prospects weren't there, and the Habs fans weren't quite as locked in to see one of the final games of the tournament, Jets and Sens. But in terms of, the physicality and stuff, the Habs game was definitely very physical. We saw some rough hits. We saw some scrapping. And actually, we saw a really nasty hit in the Sens game where Eliasson from the Sens roster ended up going on a hit from behind into the boards against Chibrikov. And guess who dropped the gloves? Elias Salamonson. Salmon Man dropped the gloves immediately, charged Eliasson. It was a bit of Swedish, I guess, violence, if you want to call it that. Obviously, the fight was over very quickly because Salamonsson's not much of a scrapper, and Eliasson's a big dude, but, it just shows the leadership and commitment that a lot of these guys are demonstrating. So just a really cool performance. Now, across this tournament, there were some very big standout players, and I'll profile them again on tomorrow's episode in a little more detail. But just from tonight's game, again, Danny Zhilkin, I think, really put on a huge performance. Worthington had a big game as well. Also, I think Colby Barlow, again, quietly very effective. I didn't talk a lot about individual players outside of DiVincentis from the first game, but Barlow, I think, came into this weekend looking to make a big statement about his place in the prospect pool. And if you were maybe like me and kind of wondering about him a little bit in the present and future, well, I think you got a little bit of a firmer answer. And Barlow, I think, definitely has a pro career of some sort, perhaps with the Jets, and I thought it was really fun. We also had, in overtime, a fun winner. Fabian Wagner ended up scoring off of a Zhilkin rebound opportunity, which is awesome. I just think it's cool to see a lot of these kids do well. And again, this is an opportunity for a lot of these youngsters to make their statement, to make their mark on the team. And I think, given where the Jets are in their timeline and sort of where this pipeline is, I thought, maybe the first game you got a little bit lucky. The second game, you could argue you also got a bit lucky. But the Jets have had to make a lot of picks out of the top 10 of the NHL draft. And I think despite that, Winnipeg has continued to amass some really fun talent. And I think a lot of the guys definitely showed pretty well. The players that I think you maybe have wanted a little more from, maybe you'd hope for a bigger showing from Kevin He, maybe from Julian. I will say for Julian's performance, I thought he was really great on the PK. He looks elite there as a shutdown 4v5 guy. I saw him make numerous defensive reads. He just was a monster when the Jets were down, and that could really make him a valuable bottom six guy if he continues to round out and develop his skill sets. So that was cool. I think for He, this is just some of the first pro-level competition that he's really faced so far, and it wasn't like it was all pros, right? You had a mixture of young prospects that he'll face in the juniors this year, plus some higher-level top-end players like Demidov. So it's really cool to have like this gamut of talent, and I think guys like him will come good. Owen Martin, I also thought from a couple of really strong shifts. He was skating in transition well, had a couple of scoring opportunities by himself, had a couple of solid passes. I thought he forechecked and defended well. All the sort of stuff that you'd want to see from somebody who's really primarily known for his two-way game. So overall, I just think that this is the sort of stuff that if you're a Winnipeg fan, you are kind of hoping that the Jets prospect pool can really deliver some solid results for the depth ranks. And, across two games, it was just fun. We haven't really had, I think, a good sense of Jets prospects in tournaments in a while. Usually when we have camps and sort of these prospect showdowns or showcases, the Jets don't usually have that many great high-end prospects joining the tournament. This is the first time where I felt like Winnipeg really brought in quite a talented group, relatively speaking. Is it, going to compete with the elite prospect pools of the NHL? No, but I think that they showed that they've got a lot of heart, a lot of fight. They pulled off some gutsy victories. And you know what? For at least 2 days in prospect scrimmages, you can say the Jets youth are completely undefeated. So fun outing. I want to talk a little bit more broadly speaking about the showdown and sort of how this might transition and bring in some momentum heading into preseason and camp. Obviously, that's happening in parallel for the big club. So guys are already skating. We've got preseason coming up this weekend. It's a really fun time for the Jets, man. It's a fun time for fans. And I know a lot of us maybe had expectations of a bigger summer. Hadn't quite happened the way we had hoped. But at least we have a lot of insight into the future of the Jets as far as some of these young prospects are concerned. And I think there could be some really solid contributors going forward. So, despite any sort of misgivings about the summer you may have, I would say it's worth getting excited about the Jets' future pipeline. But we'll talk about the Prospect Showdown and some broader takeaways coming right up. Before we close out, though, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is finally here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. FanDuel obviously has been covering some of the biggest football action and upsets. If you were watching Giants versus Cowboys, this was a great opportunity for you to cash in if you were a Cowboys fan. Maybe you thought Russ Wilson, after throwing some absolute dimes, was finally going to make the Giants relevant again, but perhaps you still had a little bit of faith in the Cowboys. Well, if you threw down a $5 bet and it was your first time and you bet on the Cowboys, guess what? You got $300 in bonus bets to go wild. And if you haven't done so, this is really the only time you can do it, right? This is the best opportunity to get in on the action right at the start of the season. Everything from player props and odds to picking who's going to win the Super Bowl. So, ready to play? Download the FanDuel app right now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some fun stuff. Obviously, Winnipeg had a nice showing here at the Prospect Showdown in Montreal. I think a lot of us were not really sure what to expect. I thought, relatively speaking, I was looking forward to seeing quite a few of the kids get some real ice time, some chances to show off. And, throughout this tournament, I think what really stood out was that some of the returning guys from previous camps and stuff really stepped up, led the way, and the Jets' goaltending proved to be one of the strongest aspects of this pool. The goaltending has always been, I would say more robust than other parts of the org. I don't know what it is that's sort of in the Scully pipeline water, man, but it is continuing to be a real backbone of the Jets org. And there's a segment tomorrow kind of talking a little bit more specifically about, how this might impact the Jets' future goaltending situation, what's going to happen with Hellebuck. But at least for this tournament, right? DiVincentis, Worthington, they put on great shows. The Jets' defense, I would say, maybe had a tougher time. Outside of Salamanson and Zalati, there wasn't a lot of consistent pro experience from a lot of the other guys. I think for the most part, the camp invites generally struggled. There were a couple of solid shifts here and there from a couple of guys, but on the whole, I don't know that anyone really found themselves making the case for, a contract offer for the Moose. On the forward side, I would say that's not necessarily the case. Chase Yoder, I thought throughout the, both games, very small sample size. He looks like a pro-level player, though. He looked good enough to where I'm a little bit surprised that with Providence this past season, he only had like 10 points. I thought he looked really active. I thought he looked really engaged. He has a layer of skill that I think is really legit. So the Jets amateur scouting continues to really identify some very solid invites. And apparently whatever it is that's in Providence, man, we just have a really good relationship with the school. We constantly find players from their program that have like legitimate pro level talent. And unlike Tanev, who was a little bit rawer coming into the org, I think Yoder is actually going to hit the ground running, relatively speaking. I see him in like a middle six or bottom six role with the Moose. This year's Manitoba squad is going to be very deep, but I think the Jets should honestly offer him a contract. He looked good enough to play with the Moose, and Manitoba having some more offensive depth really can't hurt. Yoder seems like a guy who could fit in nicely among the likes of Ford and Tanev, former Providence Friars. I came away impressed. I also came away impressed from guys like Zilkin and Salamanson, who just, again, the pro experience that they already have really showed. But I think Zilkin in particular stepped up in a way that I'd been waiting for. And, I hope that it really parlays into this upcoming season. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about what I hope for him, coming off of this performance. Is it something that I think is sustainable? Yada, yada, yada. But overall, man, fun tournament, right? I think we all kind of missed Jets hockey, especially after the way that it ended last year. And after a summer where the Jets didn't really bring in a lot of big pieces, I think a lot of us were sort of looking for some sign of optimism. Not that, a lot of us are down on the team, but I think we're all kind of in the same camp about how we feel when it comes to the Jets' playoff odds. And so, if you can think about raising the ceiling for the future of the team and getting excited about prospects, that's where I think the Jets have some really intriguing options to not only help boost the bottom six, but really overhaul this middle six tier. The depth that the Jets are developing, I think, can really support what's already a very strong core at its foundation. It just needs extra help around in the perimeter parts, and that can really elevate a lot of the Jets' matchup abilities. Do they still need to make a trade or two? Yes. But, if you don't have to trade for every single piece in your bottom six, I think that is a world of good. And it'll be cool to see the Jets over the next couple of years start to turn over some of these depth roles to some of the kids that they've drafted and developed. They got away from that several years ago. You've heard me for the past several years harp on why that's not really a good thing. So to see the Jets bring such a really big internally developed roster here to the tournament and come away with 2 victories, even if the Jets did kind of get outplayed in a couple of them, I think it's just a lot of fun. I think it's a good sign of things to come. And, Winnipeg's amateur scouting continues to deliver value for the Jets in rounds that a lot of other teams just kind of piss away. And I think Winnipeg has proven that, they're one of the teams that can extract value from almost any round that you give them. They don't always hit. You're not going to have tons of NHLers out of every one of these picks, but I promise you this. Some of these guys are going to get some real good pro time, and I think at least a couple of them will legitimately make the NHL at some point. But we'll chat about which of those guys are likely to do that on tomorrow's episode, perhaps as soon as this upcoming season, whether it's at the AHL or NHL level. We will discuss that in further detail later. But that's going to be all the time that we have for tonight's episode. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. Tomorrow and on Wednesday, we'll talk about implications from some individual standout prospect performances, what I was looking for from guys like Barlow, Zilkin, and what they actually delivered, and how it might translate towards this upcoming Moose season, right? Because I think this is really where a lot of my focus might be, aside from the Jets this year. But for tonight's show, like I said, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Appreciate you as always. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.